Gabor Mate has leveled some very interesting accusations against Jordan Peterson. Now, I do think some of his criticisms are fair and potentially there's some truth in them. However, I think by and large, he's really mischaracterizing and using arguments that are, at the end of the day, fallacies. And I'm going to walk you through why. I also should point out that I fundamentally disagree with a lot of Mate's ideas, specifically that trauma is the root cause of addiction, that trauma is the underlying cause of human suffering in all circumstances, and that the environment that we live in has more impact than the nature that we are. And I think that he's a little bit biased towards the former. So let's first analyze his argument that he leveled against Peterson.
Peterson, first of all, is very bright, extraordinarily articulate, and in some ways a compelling speaker. So he's an attractive figure in some ways. When I read him, I sense a lot of suppressed rage in him. In fact, I think his voice is choking with rage a lot of the time. It's interesting because he talks about rage, that you have to deal with it. I don't think he understands just how angry he is. And if you look at his websites, the comments are full of rage by his young acolytes. Now that's an energetic thing. That it's his energy that draws people as much as what he actually teaches.
Okay, what Mate just did here is hugely inappropriate. This is basically an ad hominem meant to undermine Jordan Peterson's intellectual arguments. And he's pathologizing and diagnosing. So he's coming from this place of superiority. And he's saying, oh, I know what's wrong with Peterson internally, and I know what's wrong with his followers. They have these specific issues. They're suppressing and repressing rage. Imagine if Jordan Peterson had done that to Sam Harris before their debates, or vice versa. Imagine if Jordan had said, oh no, Sam just has this really narcissistic pathological issue, and the reason he doesn't believe in God is because he thinks he's God. Imagine if he would have done that. He would have undermined Sam's whole personality, so then anything he said subsequently would have been invalid because his personality is pathologized. So Mate here is starting off by undermining Jordan Peterson as a person and saying that he actually has psychological issues. Instead of attacking his ideas, he's coming after Jordan and who he is, and then he's coming after his followers and saying they have suppressed rage. Now here's the other reason why this is totally wrong. Jordan Peterson actively advocates becoming more aware of your shadow, quote unquote, which means the aspects of your personality that you're uncomfortable with and that you tend to avoid and that seems socially inappropriate. Like in Freudian psychology, the superego is the thing that we all have to navigate with each other as what's societally acceptable. So we're living in this societal expectation, this landscape of values in inadvertent contractual agreements. And so we have to sometimes suppress things, urges that would be inappropriate societally, so that we can all get along and function as groups. So how exactly is Jordan Peterson advocating for suppression when he's always saying to become more aware of your aggression and integrate it and to use it? And that's what he's doing. When he's angry, sometimes he goes over the top, but he is utilizing his aggression as a mechanism for awakening and power to speak the truth rather than suppressing it. So this is a fundamentally flawed argument, and there's two problems with it. As I mentioned, the first problem, you're coming after him and you're diagnosing him? Really? You're gonna diagnose him? I mean, come on, Dr. Maté. You should know better as a doctor that to diagnose someone publicly is extremely inappropriate and is not helpful. And that you come after the ideas in the public sphere, not the people. If you were to have a private conversation with Peterson, you would be more than at liberty to voice your concerns. But you don't know him, obviously, because you're saying you want to talk to him. And so for you to diagnose someone that you don't know personally seems a bit of a stretch. Highly inappropriate.
Secondly, he teaches repression. I mean, he very rightly takes an issue where somebody mandates a certain kind of language, and he very rightly and righteously says that I will not be dictated to about what language I'm going to use. Well, good for him. I'm all in favor of not mandating language, on the one hand. On the other hand, he basically advocates repression. In his book, he talks about how an angry 2-year-old child needs to be sit by themselves until they get over it. Rather than understanding why a child would be angry at age 2, what frustrations they're having, and what human contact they need to help them move through that anger, he says repress the anger.
Yeah.
So he's all about
repressed everything anger, he says is about that.
And it's very interesting how he talks about children. He talks about little varmints and little monsters and so on. I know that's meant to be humorous, but it's also a certain way of thinking of the young human child. So fundamentally, I see him as an agent of repression. He posing as an agent of libertarianism.
Okay, here Mate does a little bit of a better job coming after Peterson's ideas. And this is totally fair ground. If he disagrees with how Peterson advocates that we raise children, fine. Public debate, I'm all for it. I don't personally know if I agree or not. I think that Peterson has very specific ideas about how children need to be socialized so that they can be integrated and functioning adults. I think that it's a lot more complicated than Mate's making it seem. I don't think Peterson is an agent of repression. I think that that's mischaracterizing his intentions and what he is doing in the world. Again, I'll just point to the fact that he actively advocates for people to integrate their aggression in their shadow. So it doesn't really make sense to call him an agent of repression. It would be more accurate to say that his child rearing advice is concerning, because then you're not making a blanket statement over his entire body of work. I don't have kids. I don't know the best way to raise kids. I couldn't tell you exactly how I felt when my parents disciplined me and what I needed and what I didn't need.
Not to mention, he's got this bee in his bonnet about what he seems to consider to be conspiracies by left-wing intellectuals. They seem to be his bête noire. Being a left-wing intellectual myself, I like to talk to him sometimes. What are you so upset about, Jordan? What are you so afraid of? You know, he talks about these bloody Marxists. And he points out very accurately all the horror that occurred under so-called Marxist regimes, particularly in the Soviet Union. He's absolutely accurate about that. But then he promotes Christianity. Shall I tell him about the mass murders that occurred in the name of Christianity? Shall I tell him about all the millions that were slaughtered in the names of the gentle Jesus? In other words, let's be fair about it. He seems to pick ideologies to attack and abhor and embrace other ideologies that are just as murderous in practice sometimes. It's a much more interesting question for me. What happened in Eastern Europe? How come, under an ideology that was meant to liberate people, so many people were oppressed? I come from Eastern Europe. I was born in Hungary.
That's exactly the question he's asking.
What it was like. But how about asking, how come a religious philosophy that was meant to promote love and acceptance and compassion has become such an agent of 2 millennia of repression, oppression, and killing? So can we be objective, or we're going to be simply tribal about it? I have a lot to say to Jordan, or as much as I appreciate actually some of what he says, and as interesting as I find him, I think he's a very mixed figure, largely an agent of repression.
I think Mate makes an interesting point here about the historical flaws of religious tribalism. I think that that's maybe a piece that Peterson might not address enough, and I would love to hear his response to that. I think that they're fundamentally a little bit separate. Cultural Marxism and Christianity are in my mind, you're taking something that's been a religious structure for thousands of years, and you're comparing it to something that's been relatively unproven. And I think that you're absolutely right, Mate, that the Crusades and a lot of the appalling acts of the Catholic Church are totally unjustifiable. And I think Sam Harris also has some very acute criticisms that are leveled against these religious institutions. So fair enough. I think that this is your strongest argument so far. And I do think that Peterson probably understands the issues of religious violence throughout history, and I think that he would have some interesting comments in response if he had the opportunity to respond to this. So I think that you're kind of smuggling in a little bit of a different topic here, because political ideologies and religious structures are different. I mean, religions have been around for millennia, so all religious institutions and socialized structures have, in one way or another, been guilty of abhorrent acts, just as human beings have. So I don't know exactly how that fits into the very specific line of thinking that cultural Marxism takes that leads seemingly inevitably to genocide. But I like this argument. I think it's a good point, and I'm going to have to think about it for a while. So thank you, Dr. Mate, for bringing this up. But the thing to remember about Mate is he believes everything essentially, and I don't want to make a blanket statement on him, so forgive me by saying everything, but he believes that there is many things can be attributed to trauma. I think that would be fair to say. Addiction can be attributed to trauma. All coping styles, a lot of them can be attributed to trauma. And so it actually really makes sense why he's further on the left side of the spectrum, because he believes that social constructionism is more powerful than the innate person that comes into the world. And this is the classic nature versus nurture debate. He's very heavily on the nurture side. He believes that people are essentially a result of how they are treated. Now, that could be a little bit of an overgeneralization, so maybe I would just say that I've heard him express beliefs that indicate that he's saying that. So I think this is fundamentally flawed. I think that biologists, neuroscientists, and psychologists are coming out with more and more evidence all the time that points to the fact that we come in with a priori biological susceptibility to specific coping styles. So I'm going to handle trauma different than you're going to handle trauma. That's why war vets all handle war differently. Children all handle their environment differently. Raise 3 children under the same household, they're all going to develop different personalities because they're different. So that's not to say that there isn't trauma, because there certainly can be traumatizing events. It just means that not everybody has the same threshold of tolerance for certain things, and not everybody gets traumatized in the same way. Some people don't even really experience heavy trauma. They get, I know people who have been in extremely stressful situations and they just sequenced right through it, and they don't seem to show any signs of significant trauma. And when you start looking at someone's personality and say, oh, they're more aggressive, therefore they have trauma, that's ridiculous. A lot of the scientific evidence shows that aggression is highly innate. Dr. Adrian Rain writes a book called The Anatomy of Violence. In The Anatomy of Violence, he lays out all of the biological precursors for aggressive behavior. So there's a lot of aggression that could be pointed to innate. So we could really, and Robert Sapolsky talks about this in his book Behave as well. As you know, he's a world famous neuroendocrinologist. He talks about how all that the environment does is bring out what you're susceptible to. So if you are susceptible to anger, then your environment might bring that out. If you're susceptible to trauma, your environment might bring that out. If you're susceptible to depression, your environment might bring that out. These are all very complicated issues that nature and nurture are always working together to create life experience. So as a recovering alcoholic and addict myself, I've been sober for 8 years. I take issue with Maté saying it's all about trauma. I happen to look through my family bloodline and see alcoholism all over. And there's strong genetic probability that alcoholism is innate, at least in part. It's heritable. And so for Maté to say that it's all a matter of trauma, then why doesn't everyone who have trauma develop alcoholism? The reason for that is because everybody copes with things differently based on their own innate a priori susceptibility. I want to say that I don't mean to be too rough with Maté here. I think that he is a valuable voice in the field. I don't agree with his outlook on trauma. I don't think that viewing everything or most life issues as results of trauma is helpful. I think that there's a lot of flaws in that. However, I do think that as far as trauma is a part of human life, which it is, he has some very valuable things to say about it. And I do value his teachings, and he seems to be a pretty smart guy. I fundamentally disagree with the things he says, a lot of them, but respectfully, I hope it seems respectful, even though I feel a little bit frustrated with the way he handled this interview. Thanks, everyone.